So behavioural insights draws on around 40 or 50 years worth of research in the behavioural sciences, primarily social psychology and behavioural economics, about human behaviour and why we make the decisions that we do. And so it gives a good sense of some of the biases and heuristics that we use when we think about the adoption of technology like AVs. And it shows us that we're not always the sort of rational economic actors that we might expect in textbooks. So we're heavily influenced by what those around us think, by the way that things are framed, and the salience of benefits and risks. So for example, in terms of the salience of benefits and risk, we've seen, for example, the impact of things like airline crashes or 9/11 leading to high levels of passenger anxiety and a huge dramatic drop in passenger volumes, despite the fact that safety risks largely stayed the same. But some of the measures that were put in place following that were enough to convince many passengers to continue travelling, particularly as the benefits of airline travel were seen so high. But certainly that will be a factor in the early adoption of AB, would be the availability bias, we would call it, how well the public can recall any accidents and how much the media makes of that. The second thing is really, I think, one of the most interesting aspects of this from a sort of human behaviour and perception point of view is around the level of control that humans have. So will they still be able to control braking or steerings at all times, just in an emergency? And there may be some trade-offs there between what is actually most safe and what consumers will accept. So that element of control, I imagine humans will be reluctant to give up. And finally, even things like subtle changes to language may have an impact. So things like autonomous vehicles may actually feel like quite a foreign term to some people and remind people of artificial intelligence and a sense of sort of robotics taking over. And even things like driverless cars may feel like no one's actually in charge. And they might actually be more comfortable with things like piloted vehicles, which it feels like there's still someone in charge controlling the vehicle. So relatively subtle changes to the language, to people's perception of benefits and risks, and certainly what they see around them and what their friends do, I think will have a big influence on how the public perceives autonomous vehicles. Well, I think the approach Singapore has taken is exactly the right one in terms of some actual real trials that the public can come and see for themselves, for example, in the Chinese and Japanese gardens. That's a great way of encouraging consumers to come and have a look and try their technology for themselves. The question is, how do you take that to scale? And clearly they're a self-selected group, so asking just their perceptions is not going to be reflective of the whole population. I think one of the interesting things would be to look at the different segments that you're trying to attract and engage as well. And one of the criticisms of electric cars has been the sort of focus very heavily on the sort of eco-conscious consumer, rather than, for example, the main body of the market, in particular the sort of petroheads side of things. So actually, I think quite an interesting idea in terms of gauging public interest and taking it to the mass market would be, as we've seen from recent testing from some of the manufacturers, to do this at high speed with no one in. So, you know, for example, they've used it on racetracks in, I believe it's in Germany, where they've taken it at, you know, high speeds, 140k around the racetracks. And that to me is an interesting thing to think through. You know, before the Singapore Grand Prix, could you try a piloted car going around and seeing how fast, taking it to a vast audience and getting them to think about the different ways that this technology can be used? Because some of the actual practical trials, for example, in Chinese and Japanese gardens, will necessarily be relatively low speed, will be safe, will be comfortable for passengers. But actually seeing the full range of possibilities, I think is, and the sort of fun aspects of that, will be an interesting way to engage a range of stakeholders and the public, I think, in the discussion. I think build on the early success that it's already having. So I absolutely believe that demonstrations of this in real life are the way to test out a variety of perceptions and behaviours and to get the public involved in that debate. So something really interesting is how subtle changes to the design or levels of control affect people's perceptions of safety, desirability, ability to pay, and desire to pay. And I think that's really interesting. So we've seen some early test sites using, golf carts and going at relatively low speeds with relatively little ability for the passenger to influence other than brakes. So the question would be now, what would that change if it actually looked like a car itself rather than a golf buddy, if the speeds were slightly higher? What would the difference be if it had a steering wheel or without? And those subtle differences, I actually think, will have a huge impact on public perceptions. And so my one piece of advice would be to keep running those practical trials and to try different things each time and subtle alterations to the way it's being used to understand how the public reacts to that.